The ballroom on the 42nd floor of the Brennan Financial Group Tower smelled like fresh flowers and expensive catering, and 40 years of other people's ambition. I stood near the east window with a glass of champagne I hadn't touched, watching the room the way I used to watch construction sites, looking for the thing that was slightly off, the beam that didn't quite sit flush, the joint that would fail under pressure. I had been an engineer before I became a chairman. Old habits. The gala was everything Rebecca had planned it to be. 300 guests in evening wear. A string quartet in the corner playing something I didn't recognize. The company logo projected in soft gold light across the ceiling, a logo she had redesigned 18 months ago, removing the small architectural compass that Eleanor had chosen in 1984. The waitstaff moved through the crowd in crisp black uniforms. The bar was open. The speeches were scheduled for 9. I had been in this building for 40 years, and tonight it looked like a place I had never been. I spotted Rebecca near the entrance to the private corridor, the one that led to the executive elevators. She was speaking to a man I recognized, dark suit, earpiece, the particular stillness of someone trained to stand and watch. David Chen had worked building security for 15 years. I had hired him personally. He had attended Eleanor's memorial. He knew where every camera in this building was positioned, and he knew my face better than most people in this room. I watched Rebecca lean toward him. Her hand moved a small gesture, fingers pointing in my direction. David looked at me. Then he looked back at her. Even from 30 feet away, I could see the hesitation in his posture. His weight shifted. He tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he's been asked something that doesn't quite make sense to him. I set my champagne on the windowsill. The glass left a small ring on the white linen. I watched it. Rebecca's voice carried across the room before she intended it to. That happened sometimes with people who were accustomed to being obeyed. They forgot to keep the volume calibrated. "He's not supposed to be here tonight," she said. Not a whisper anymore. "Please remove him. He's no longer part of this company." The couple at the bar nearest to me stopped talking. A woman in a blue dress turned her head. Someone laughed somewhere behind me. Not at this. Just the ordinary laughter of a party. And then the space around me went quiet in the specific way that spaces go quiet when people are pretending they didn't hear something they absolutely heard. David began walking toward me. His expression was careful. He was a professional, and professionals do not let their faces show the thing they're actually thinking. But I had known David Chen for 15 years, and I could read the particular set of his jaw. He did not want to be doing this. I didn't move. I had learned a long time ago, before the company, before Eleanor, before any of this, that the most powerful position in any room is stillness. Movement signals uncertainty. Stillness signals that you already know how this ends. He stopped 3 feet from me. "Mr. Brennan," he said, quietly. The way you say a name when you're hoping the person attached to it will give you a way out of an impossible situation. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked past him, at Rebecca, who was standing with her arms slightly crossed, her chin elevated, the expression of a woman who had given an instruction and was waiting for it to be executed. Thomas was somewhere behind her. I'd seen him earlier, near the stage, talking to the CFO. He wasn't here now. I noted that. "David," I said, "hold on 1 second." My voice came out exactly the way I intended it to. Not raised, not hurried. The way you speak when you have already done everything that needed to be done, and the only remaining question is whether the other person understands what they're standing inside of. The couple at the bar had stopped pretending. 3 more guests had turned. A woman I recognized, Margaret Lau, one of our earliest institutional investors, a person who had been in this business since before Thomas was born, was watching from near the stage with the expression of someone doing very careful arithmetic. I looked at Rebecca. She looked back at me with the particular confidence of someone who had spent 4 years preparing for this moment and believed she had covered every variable. She had not covered every variable. "I want to make sure everyone in this room is clear," I said. The string quartet had paused between pieces. The timing was not something I had arranged. It was simply the kind of thing that happens when you wait long enough. "Mrs. Hale Brennan just told the head of building security to remove me from this event. She said I'm no longer part of this company. I paused. I am the co-founder of Brennan Financial Group. I am the chairman of its board. And as of this morning, I hold 67% of the outstanding shares through a trust instrument that has been on file with this company's own legal counsel for 11 years. I looked at David. I'm not going anywhere tonight. The room did not erupt. It didn't need to. The silence that followed was louder than anything that could have been said. Margaret Lau set down her drink. David Chen straightened slightly, and the careful expression on his face shifted into something that looked, very briefly, like relief. Rebecca's arms uncrossed. Her chin came down. I picked up my champagne from the windowsill, where it had been sitting undisturbed for the last 4 minutes. The ring it had left on the linen was already drying. There was a great deal she didn't know yet. The evening was young. The first time I walked into what would become Brennan Financial Group, it wasn't a company, it was a converted storage room on the 3rd floor of a building on Larimer Street that smelled like old carpet and the coffee Eleanor brewed on a hot plate she'd brought from home. The year was 1985. I was 24 years old, a civil engineer who had spent 2 years designing drainage systems for the city, and Eleanor Hale was 23, recently graduated from CU Boulder with a degree in economics and a set of ideas about financial technology that most people in Denver that year couldn't follow and didn't try to. I could follow them. That was how it started. Eleanor had the vision. I want to be precise about that, because it matters. It has always mattered. And in recent years, I've had specific reasons to make sure the record stays clear. She understood, before the term existed in common use, that the future of financial services was in the architecture of information, how data moved, how it was stored, how ordinary people could access tools that had previously existed only for institutions. She could see the shape of that future the way a surveyor sees terrain, not as it currently was, but as it could be mapped. What she needed was someone who could build the systems she was describing. I was an engineer. I knew how to build things that had to hold weight. We incorporated in March of 1985. We signed the paperwork at a kitchen table in Eleanor's apartment on Capitol Hill, witnessed by her roommate, a woman named Carla who was studying nursing and who told us afterward that she had no idea what we were doing, but that Eleanor seemed very certain, so it was probably going to be fine. I've thought about Carla many times over the years. She was right. The early years were not easy, and I won't pretend otherwise. There were months when the payroll came from a line of credit against my car. There were contracts we lost, systems I had to rebuild from scratch, presentations Eleanor made to rooms full of men who asked her to repeat herself or deferred their questions to me. She never showed the frustration in those rooms. In the car afterward, driving back to the office, she would be quiet for a few minutes, and then she would say something like, "They'll understand it when they see it running." And by the time we arrived, she had already moved on to the next problem. That was Eleanor's vision. Made practical, she could hold the long view without losing the present moment. By the mid-90s, Brennan Financial Group had offices on 3 floors of a building in the financial district. By 2000, we had 87 employees and a client list that included 4 of the largest credit unions in Colorado. Eleanor was the public face of the company. She gave the speeches, chaired the board meetings, represented us at industry conferences. I ran the technical infrastructure and, increasingly, the operations. We had built something that worked because we had built it together, each of us doing the thing the other couldn't. The employees knew Eleanor. They knew her by name, by habit, by the way she remembered things about their lives, their children's names, the towns they'd come from, the small difficulties they'd mentioned once in passing. She kept a notebook. I didn't know about it until after she died, when her assistant brought it to me. It had 412 entries, every person who had ever worked for Brennan Financial Group, with a note beside each name. She passed away in October of 2004, pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in April, gone by October, 6 months. She was 42 years old. In the last week, when she was home, and the medication made it difficult to stay awake for long, she said something to me that I have kept in a specific place in my memory, separate from the ordinary accumulation of years. She said, "Don't let anyone take this apart. It's ours, mine, and yours, and the people who built it with us. Don't let someone come in and decide they understand it better than we do." I told her I wouldn't. She looked at me for a moment, the way she used to look at a problem she was trying to solve, and then she closed her eyes. She died 4 days later, on a Tuesday morning, with the first snow of the season coming down outside the window. I kept that promise for 15 years. I ran the company the way Eleanor would have recognized, not identically, because things change and she would have understood that, but with the same principles underneath. I maintained the Eleanor Brennan Fund, which she had established in 2001 to support financial literacy programs in underserved communities across Colorado. I kept her photograph in the lobby, the one taken in 1997 when we won our first Regional Industry Award. Eleanor standing at a podium with that particular expression she had when she'd just said something she knew was true and was waiting for the room to catch up. I kept the notebook. I had it in my office for 15 years. Thomas was born in 1988, which meant Eleanor raised him through the company's most difficult growth period, and he grew up understanding the business the way children understand the places their parents inhabit by proximity, by absorption. By years of overhearing conversations at the dinner table, he was intelligent and capable, and when he joined the company after graduate school, I thought we were continuing something. I still believe that was his intention. Thomas, at his core, is not a dishonest person. That has made certain things harder to understand and certain things easier to forgive, though I haven't decided yet where the line falls. He met Rebecca 3 years after I'd promoted him to vice president. She had come to Denver from Chicago, where she'd spent 8 years in financial consulting, and she was, I want to be accurate here, too genuinely impressive. She was 41, she was sharp, and she had a way of identifying inefficiencies in an organization that was real and not performed. In the first meeting where I heard her speak, she made 3 observations about our client onboarding process that I had been meaning to address for 2 years. I told Thomas afterward that she was good. I meant it. They married 18 months later. I gave a toast at the wedding that I wrote myself, and I meant every word of it. Rebecca joined Brennan Financial Group as Chief Operating Officer 14 months after the wedding. Her title was COO. Her actual project, which I did not understand at first and which became clear to me only gradually over the course of a year and a half, was something else entirely. It began with what she called modernization. The logo was the first thing a redesign, she said, to reflect a more contemporary brand identity. I raised no objection. Logos change. Then it was the onboarding materials. Then the office layout on the second floor. Then a restructuring of 3 departments that resulted in the departure of 7 employees who had been with the company for more than a decade. Each change had a business rationale. Each rationale was defensible. I am an engineer. I understand systems, and I understand that systems require maintenance and revision. I told myself that what I was watching was maintenance. Then she changed the name of the Eleanor Brennan Fund. She sent a memo to the board. The memo described the rebranding as part of a cohesive organizational identity initiative. The new name was the Brennan Excellence Fund. The memo did not mention Eleanor by name. It referred to the fund's legacy structure and noted that the new name would better reflect the company's forward momentum. I read that memo 3 times. Then I put it in a file I had started keeping in a drawer at home, separate from my office files. The file had a label. The label said, Documentation. I also began to understand what was happening to my own position. My title was chairman. My actual authority, over the course of that year, had been quietly redistributed board votes I was informed of after the fact, decisions made in meetings I hadn't been invited to, a gradual reorientation of the company's reporting structure that left my office increasingly peripheral. Rebecca was thorough. She had understood, correctly, that the most effective way to remove someone from power is not to confront them, but to make them irrelevant. She had been doing it methodically, one small adjustment at a time, and she had been doing it for the better part of 18 months before I acknowledged to myself, sitting alone in my office one evening with Eleanor's photograph on the wall across from me, that this was intentional. I didn't say anything. Not then. Thomas was in the middle of it, and I didn't yet know how much he understood of what his wife was doing. I didn't know whether he was a participant or a bystander. I needed to know which one before I moved. I picked up the phone and called Sarah Okonkwo, who had been the company's legal counsel for 22 years. It was a Thursday evening in late November. Sarah picked up on the second ring. I told her I had some questions about the original incorporation documents, the trust structure, and Eleanor's estate provisions. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been waiting for this call. Marcus, I have some things you should see." I told her I'd come in the following morning. I drove home on Spear Boulevard, the same road I had driven for 34 years, and I thought about Eleanor's notebook. 412 names. Every person who had ever worked for what we built. I thought not yet, but soon. The first change was the logo. Rebecca presented it at the September board meeting, a Tuesday, overcast, the kind of Denver morning where the mountains disappear entirely behind cloud cover. She had a consulting firm's presentation on the screen, 12 slides, all clean lines and market research. The new logo was a geometric B in navy blue, sans serif. Modern, she said, scalable across digital platforms. She used the word legacy 4 times in the presentation, and not once did she mean Eleanor. The old logo had been Eleanor's idea. Not a portrait, nothing so obvious, just a small compass rose in the lower corner of the B, because Eleanor had said once that a company should always know which direction it's facing. She'd sketched it herself on a legal pad in 1987, handed it to a designer she'd found through a classified ad in the Denver Post, and paid him $400. The compass rose had been on every letterhead, every business card, every annual report for 33 years. Rebecca's new B had no compass, just a clean angle and a shadow effect that the consulting firm said tested well with audiences under 40. Thomas voted yes. The other board members, 3 of whom Rebecca had recommended for their seats in the past 2 years, voted yes. I abstained. Rebecca noted my abstention in the minutes without comment and moved to the next agenda item. I drove home that evening and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Eleanor's compass rose had been on the mug I used every morning. I turned it in my hands. The ceramic was worn at the handle where I'd held it for years. I set it down carefully, the same way I always did, and went to bed. I didn't say anything to Thomas for 3 weeks. When I finally did a Sunday afternoon, his car in my driveway, Rebecca at a conference in Seattle, I asked him simply whether he'd thought about what his mother would have said. Thomas looked at the floor for a moment. He said, "Dad," she would have understood. "The company needs to move forward." He said it the way people say things they've rehearsed, but don't quite believe. I told him I heard him. I didn't tell him what I was thinking. The second change came 14 months later. The Eleanor Brennan Fund for Women in Tech had been Eleanor's project, not a board initiative, not a PR strategy, but something she had built herself in the last 3 years of her life. She had personally reviewed every application. She had written letters to recipients. There was a photograph in the fund's office on the 4th floor of Eleanor sitting across a table from a young woman named Patricia Yuen, who had gone on to found a software company in Boulder. Eleanor was laughing in the photograph. I don't know what had been said. I only know that Patricia Yuen had sent flowers to Eleanor's funeral. The new name was the Brennan Excellence Fund. Rebecca announced it in a company-wide email on a Wednesday morning under the subject line, "Exciting Rebrand." The email included a new logo, the same navy B's applied to the fund materials, and a revised mission statement that removed all reference to women in technology. The mission was now supporting innovation and professional development across all disciplines. The plaque on the 4th floor came down the following week. I know the exact day because David Chen mentioned it to me in passing, not then, but later, when it mattered. At the time, I only saw the pale rectangle on the wall where the plaque had been. The paint slightly darker there, protected from years of light. They put up a new plaque, brushed aluminum. The Brennan Excellence Fund. No date. No origin story. I called Sarah Okonkwo that evening. Not about the fund, not yet. I asked her a narrower question whether the original fund documents had been filed with Eleanor's estate provisions, or separately. Sarah said separately. She said the fund had been established as a restricted gift, with Eleanor named as founding donor in perpetuity. She said in perpetuity carefully, and I understood she was telling me something without saying it directly. I thanked her and said I'd follow up. I didn't follow up for another 11 months. I was still watching. The third change was the one I had not expected to affect me as much as it did. The hallway on the second floor had always had 4 photographs. They'd been there since 2001, when Eleanor commissioned a photographer to document the company's history. The largest was from 1985, Eleanor and I standing in the original office on Larimer Street before the move to the current building. Eleanor was holding a printout code, a long string of it, the kind that meant nothing to me then and means nothing to me now, but meant everything to her. She was laughing. I was looking at her. I hadn't noticed that detail until years after the photograph was hung, that I was looking at her, not at the camera. I came in on a Monday in March to find the photograph gone. In its place was a framed image of Rebecca at last year's gala, standing at the podium, the Brennan Financial Group banner behind her. The photograph was professionally lit. Rebecca was looking directly at the camera. I stood in that hallway for a moment. The cleaning crew was working at the far end of the corridor. One of them, a man named Gerald, who had worked nights in the building for 9 years, glanced up and then looked away. I think he understood that I didn't want to be spoken to. I went to my office. I sat down. I did not count the ceiling tiles because I already knew there were 22. I had counted them before, on a different kind of bad day. What I understood standing in that hallway was that Rebecca was not simply updating the company. She was revising its history, the logo, the fund, the photographs. Each one was a layer of Eleanor being removed, replaced, smoothed over. In 5 years, or 10, a new employee would walk that hallway and see Rebecca at the podium and believe that was where Brennan Financial Group had always begun. They would have no reason to think otherwise. There would be nothing left to tell them differently. I called Sarah Okonkwo that afternoon, not in the evening, this time in the middle of the afternoon, from my office, with the door closed. I asked her directly, did Eleanor leave anything to protect her legacy, anything with legal standing? Sarah was quiet for 4 seconds. I counted. Then she said, yes. Eleanor established a separate trust, independent of the company structure, independent of the estate. The trust has specific provisions. If her founding role is materially misrepresented or erased from the company's public record, the trust transfers entirely to an external charitable foundation. She paused. But there's a second instrument. Eleanor prepared a handwritten letter and a copy of her original will, sealed separately, held outside the estate filing. She gave the key to a trust manager she chose herself. His name is James Whitmore. He's been holding it for 20 years. I wrote the name on the notepad in front of me. James Whitmore. 2 words. Does Thomas know about this? I asked. No, Sarah said. Eleanor was very specific about that. I looked at Eleanor's name on the notepad. Then I looked at the empty space on my wall where I had always meant to hang a copy of that 1985 photograph and never had. I'll need James Whitmore's contact information, I said. Sarah gave it to me without hesitation. I think she had been waiting to give it to me for a long time. I wrote down the number. I did not call it that day. I put the notepad in the top drawer of my desk, closed the drawer, and went back to work. There were things I needed to understand before I moved. There were pieces I needed in place. Eleanor had built this company with the patience of someone who knew that the right structure, laid correctly, would hold for decades. I had learned that from her. I was not finished learning it yet. The Thanksgiving table that year seated 11 people. Thomas and Rebecca had hosted their house in Cherry Hills Village. the one they'd bought 2 years after the wedding with the down payment Thomas had asked me not to mention in front of Rebecca's family. I remember the smell of the kitchen, the good candles Rebecca always used, the way the dining room looked warm and deliberate, like a photograph someone had already decided to take. Rebecca was talking about the company's rebranding initiative. She had been talking about it for most of the meal. The word legacy came up several times, each time in a context that made it sound like a problem to be managed rather than a foundation to build on. The company needs a new image, she said. She was addressing the table generally, but she had a way of speaking that made every statement feel like a decision already made. Eleanor and the people from her generation, they built something real. I respect that, but a company can't live in the past. The market doesn't care about history. It cares about what you're going to do next. I set down my fork. I did it slowly because I had learned a long time ago that the speed at which you set something down tells the room more than your words do. Eleanor isn't the past, I said. She's the foundation. Every client relationship we have, every risk model we use, every principle the company operates on, those came from her. You're not building on top of history. You're standing on it. Rebecca smiled. It was the smile of someone who had anticipated the objection and was mildly pleased to have it confirmed. I have the deepest respect for Eleanor, she said. Truly. But her era is over. The people who are going to take this company forward are the ones with new ideas, new energy. That's not a criticism. That's just how time works. I looked at Thomas. He was cutting his turkey. He did not look up. I said nothing more. After dinner, while the others moved to the living room, I drove home on I-25 with the radio off. I sat in my driveway for 4 minutes. The garage light had a motion sensor, and it clicked off while I was still sitting there. I went inside and called Sarah Okonkwo at 9:40 in the evening. She answered on the second ring. "I'm ready," I said. "Contact James Whitmore." There was a pause. Not surprised, something more like recognition. "I'll reach him Monday morning," she said. "Thank you." I hung up. I put the phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a while looking at the window above the sink. It was dark outside, and I could see my own reflection in the glass. That was the last time I spoke about Eleanor to anyone in that family. What followed was 4 years of silence. Not the silence of someone who has given up, the silence of someone who is counting. I went to work. I attended the quarterly board meetings. I signed the documents placed in front of me, and I noted the ones that were not placed in front of me. Thomas grew distant in the way that people grow distant when they are working hard to believe something that doesn't quite hold, not cold. Exactly. But careful, measured, like a man who has been told what to think and is still in the process of convincing himself. Rebecca consolidated, methodically, without drama, the way a good executive operates. I watched her do it, and I let her. Every step she took left a record. Every decision she made without me was a document. I had learned from 40 years of engineering that the most dangerous structures are the ones built without proper review. They hold until they don't. And when they fail completely. James Whitmore and I spoke 6 times over those 4 years. Sarah Okonkwo reviewed 3 sets of documents. I made 2 changes and left the rest exactly as Eleanor had written it. I was not idle. I was precise. The Brennan Financial Group occupied the top 6 floors of a glass tower on 17th Street, and on the 40th anniversary of its founding, the building's lobby had been transformed into something Eleanor would not have recognized. There were white orchids on every surface, a string quartet playing near the east windows, and a banner stretched across the marble entrance that read, 40 years of innovation in the company's new font, a clean sans serif that had replaced the original lettering 3 years ago. The original lettering had been Eleanor's choice. She had spent 2 weeks selecting it. I remembered watching her hold printed samples up to the window of our first office to see how they looked in natural light. I arrived at 7:15. The invitation in my breast pocket said 7 o'clock, but I had learned long ago that arriving slightly late to an event you helped create changes the geometry of a room. People have already settled. Conversations have already formed. You can move through the space and observe without being absorbed into it. The valet took my car without recognizing me. That was fine. The young woman at the registration table found my name, handed me a lanyard with a printed badge, and smiled in the way that people smile at strangers they are paid to welcome. I thanked her and walked in. Thomas was near the bar on the far side of the room, talking to two men I recognized from the board. He was wearing a dark suit and the particular expression he'd had since childhood when he was performing confidence rather than feeling it, chin slightly elevated, gestures slightly too deliberate. I had watched him practice that expression in the mirror when he was 14. He did not see me come in, or if he did, he made no sign of it. Rebecca was at the center of the room, near the main display, a timeline of the company's history mounted on an illuminated panel. She was speaking to a group of investors, her hand moving in small, precise arcs the way it always did when she was making a point she considered self-evident. I looked at the timeline panel from across the room. I could see the years, the milestones, the photographs. I could not see, from that distance, how many of them still included Eleanor's name. I took a glass of water from a passing server and moved toward the south wall. That was when David Chen found me. He had been with the company for 15 years, first as a contracted security officer and then as head of building operations for our floor. He was 53 now, heavier than when I'd last seen him, with the same careful way of moving through a room that I had always associated with people who pay attention for a living. He came toward me at an angle that suggested he had been watching the entrance and had seen me arrive. He extended his hand. "Mr. Brennan, sir, it's good to see you here." I shook it. His grip was the same as it had always been, firm, without performance. "David," I said. He glanced briefly toward the center of the room, then back at me. He lowered his voice, not dramatically, just enough. "I wanted you to know something," he said. "I still remember Eleanor. We all do, the people who've been here long enough. She was the heart of this company." He paused. "Mrs. Rebecca. She can change the logo, change the name on things, but she can't change what we remember." I looked at him for a moment. He was not asking for anything. He was not positioning himself. He was simply telling me the truth because he had decided it needed to be said, and he was the kind of man who says things when they need saying. "Thank you, David," I said. He nodded once. Then he said, "There's something else." I waited. "Yesterday morning," he said, "Mrs. Rebecca came up to the fourth floor. She had a facilities worker with her, one of the contractors, not our regular staff. She was trying to remove a plaque from the wall outside the old executive suite, the one that's been there since the beginning." He kept his voice level. "It says Eleanor Brennan, founder, the original brass plaque. I don't think most people even know it's still up there. That floor's been used for storage and overflow for years." I set my water glass down on the ledge beside me. I asked her what she was doing. David continued. "She said the plaque didn't fit the new brand image. I told her that plaque was part of the building's history and that any structural or signage changes above the third floor required facilities approval and documentation." He paused. "She told me I was overstepping. I told her I was doing my job. She left without the plaque." If you've ever found yourself holding on to something, a name, a memory, a small piece of someone who's gone, and felt the specific cold of knowing someone else is trying to erase it, you know what I felt standing there. The fourth floor, Eleanor and I had shared an office up there in the first years, a single room with 2 desks pushed together because we couldn't afford separate spaces. We had drafted the company's first client contracts on a folding table by the window. The plaque had been installed when we moved to the larger suite on the 6th floor. A small ceremony. Just the 2 of us and a building manager who had since retired. Eleanor had laughed at the formality of it. She had said, "Marcus, it's just brass." I had told her it was a record. She had been right that it was just brass. I had been right that it was a record. Rebecca had changed the lobby signage, removed Eleanor's photographs from the main corridor, renamed the foundation. All of that had been visible. All of that had been documented. But the 4th floor plaque that was different. That floor was quiet. Almost no one went there. Rebecca had not been performing a rebranding. She had been erasing something she believed no one was watching. She had miscalculated on that point. "David," I said, "how long have you known about the other changes, the corridor photographs, the foundation name?" He was quiet for a moment. "Long enough," he said. "I kept notes, dates, what was changed, who authorized it." He looked at me steadily. I didn't know if it mattered to anyone, but I kept them. 15 years. The man had been in this building for 15 years, watching and keeping notes, because that was what careful people do when they work somewhere they respect. "It matters," I said. "You're a loyal man. Eleanor would have thanked you for this." He nodded again, the same single nod. "Is there anything you need from me tonight, sir?" I thought about that for a moment. The string quartet was playing something I didn't recognize. Across the room, Rebecca had moved away from the investor group and was now standing near the timeline panel, speaking to a photographer. Thomas was still at the bar. Neither of them had looked in my direction. "Not yet," I said, "but stay close." He returned to his post near the entrance. I stood at the south wall for another minute, holding nothing, watching the room. I had been prepared for most of what tonight would bring. I had not known about the plaque. That was new information, and new information requires a moment of stillness before it becomes useful. I gave it that moment. Then I finished my water and walked toward the center of the room. The quartet had switched to something slower. The tempo change was subtle. Most people in the room wouldn't have noticed it. I noticed it because I had been standing still for long enough that the music had become the only thing moving around me. I took a glass of champagne from a passing server. I didn't drink it. I held it the way you hold something when you want to look occupied without being occupied. It's a habit from the years before this, from the job sites, from the long meetings where you learn that the most useful thing a man can do is appear comfortable while he is, in fact, cataloging everything. The room was at capacity. I estimated 240 guests, maybe 250. Denver's financial sector was well represented. I recognized board members from 3 regional banks, 2 venture funds, and the development group that had handled our building expansion in 2019. There were people here who had known Eleanor. There were people here who had never heard her name. Rebecca was still near the timeline panel when I first saw her notice me. I didn't see the exact moment she recognized me. I was looking at the panel itself, at the photograph from 1987, Eleanor in her yellow blazer standing outside the original office on Larimer Street. But I felt the shift in the room's attention before I turned. That's the thing about a room full of people who know each other when someone's energy changes. It moves through the crowd like a current. You learn to feel it before you see it. When I turned, Rebecca was already walking toward David Chen. David was standing near the entrance corridor, where he had been positioned most of the evening. I watched her reach him. I watched her speak. I could not hear what she said, but I could read the shape of the conversation from 40 feet away. I'd spent enough years watching people negotiate in rooms where I couldn't hear them. She was giving him an instruction. He was not accepting it. She said something else. He shook his head once, very slightly. Not the gesture of a man who was uncertain. The gesture of a man who had already made his decision. Rebecca's expression didn't change visibly. That was the thing about her. She had learned to keep her face controlled in public, but her hand moved to her clutch and stayed there, and she turned from David with the kind of deliberate composure that only appears when someone is actively suppressing something. She walked toward me. I didn't move. I kept the champagne glass at my side. I watched her cross the floor past the string quartet, past a cluster of guests near the bar, past a woman in a green dress who turned to say something to her and received a brief, dismissive smile in return. Rebecca was not stopping for anyone. She had a destination. She stopped 3 feet from me. For a moment, she said nothing. I said nothing. The quartet was playing something with a cello line that moved underneath everything else, slow and deliberate. Around us, guests continued their conversations. No one had looked over yet. "Marcus," she said, not a question, not a greeting. "Rebecca." You weren't on the guest list for this event." "I know." "Then you understand that you're not supposed to be here." I looked at her. She was wearing a dark navy dress, her hair pulled back, the kind of presentation that takes significant effort to make look effortless. She had prepared for tonight the way she prepared for everything thoroughly and with attention to what other people would see. What she had not prepared for was the conversation she was about to have. "This is a company event," she said. Her voice was controlled, but she had raised it slightly, not enough to draw immediate attention, but enough that the couple nearest to us had paused their conversation. "You are not part of this company anymore, Marcus. You stepped back. You signed the transition documents. That was your choice." "It was," I said. "Then you understand why you being here is inappropriate." I didn't answer that. She waited 2 seconds. Then she said it, not quietly, not as a whisper, but as a declaration, the kind of statement designed to be heard. "You're not invited to this event. Your era is over. The people in this room are here to celebrate what this company is becoming, not what it used to be." The couple to my left had stopped pretending not to listen. A man in a gray suit 3 feet to my right had turned slightly. The current was moving through the room again. "David," she raised her voice further, turning her head without taking her eyes off me. "David, please escort Mr. Brennan out." David Chen did not move. I could see him from my peripheral vision. He was standing exactly where he had been standing. His hands were at his sides. His expression was the expression of a man who has been asked to do something he is not going to do. Rebecca turned fully toward him. "David." "Ma'am." His voice was even. I said, "Escort him out." "I heard you, ma'am." The room had gone partially quiet in the area around us. Not the whole room. The far end was still loud with conversation. The bar was still busy, but the 20 or 30 people within range had registered that something was happening. I watched a woman near the timeline panel touch her companion's arm. I watched the photographer lower his camera. Thomas was at the bar. He had turned. He was looking at us. He did not move. Rebecca's voice came up another register. "David, remove him. Now." The word "remove" carried across the room the way certain words do in certain rooms. It has a particular sound, an edge that cuts through ambient noise. Several more heads turned. An investor I recognized from a board meeting 3 years ago, Gerald Ashworth, 64. Ashworth Capital looked over from 10 feet away. He did not look away. I stood still. I had counted 14 people who were now watching directly. There would be more at the edges. This was the moment Rebecca had designed to be the end of something. She had chosen a public setting because she believed that public settings protected her, that I would be too concerned with dignity to resist, that I would accept the humiliation quietly and leave, and the story would be told afterward as the founder was asked to leave, and he left. Thomas still had not moved from the bar. I looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. He looked back at me. His face had the expression I had seen on it for the past 4 years, not cruelty, not agreement, but the particular blankness of a man who has decided that looking away is not the same thing as choosing. He had told himself that story long enough that he believed it. I turned back to Rebecca. She was waiting. She was still composed, still controlled, but there was something underneath it now. Not uncertainty exactly, but the first small awareness that the scene was not proceeding the way she had rehearsed it. David had not moved. I had not moved. The room was watching. "You want to remove me from my company," I said. I kept my voice level. Not loud. I didn't need loud. The room was quiet enough. "I understand that. I've understood it for some time. This is not your company anymore. Marcus, you need to—" "Before I go," I said, "there's something I'd like you to know." She stopped. I set the champagne glass down on the high-top table beside me. I set it down carefully, without sound. I looked at her, and I let the silence sit for 3 full seconds, the kind of silence that, in a quiet room, feels much longer than it is. Gerald Ashworth had taken 2 steps closer. David Chen had not moved. The photographer had raised his camera again, not to take a picture, but the way people raise cameras when they don't know what they're about to see. Thomas was still at the bar, still watching. still silent. I said nothing yet. I let Rebecca stand in the silence she had created, in the room she had filled with witnesses, in front of the timeline panel that still held Eleanor's photograph, the yellow blazer, the Larimer Street office, 1987, the beginning of everything she had spent 4 years trying to erase. I waited one more second. Then I spoke. The room was not completely quiet. There was still music somewhere. I could hear it faintly. The string quartet Rebecca had hired for the evening, playing something I didn't recognize from the far side of the atrium. But in the immediate space around us, near the timeline panel and the cluster of guests who had gathered after David's confrontation with Rebecca, the music might as well have been in another building. I had stood up slowly, not dramatically. I didn't push my chair back with force or rise to my full height in a way designed to command attention. I simply stood the way a man stands when he has decided something, and I straightened my jacket and I looked at Rebecca. She was still holding the small evening clutch she'd carried all night. Her knuckles were pale against the fabric. I said, "Rebecca, I think there's been some confusion about who has the authority to remove anyone from this room." My voice was level. I had practiced that levelness for 40 years, first as an engineer, reading site reports that contained bad news, then as a chairman reading quarterly numbers that contained worse news. The voice that does not change is the voice people listen to. Rebecca's voice had been sharp and certain when she spoke to David. Mine was neither of those things. It was simply present. She said, "Marcus, this isn't the place." "You chose the place," I said, "not me." Gerald Ashworth had not moved from his position 2 steps closer than before. The photographer, a young man Rebecca had hired from a Denver agency, whose name I later learned was Paul Reyes, had his camera at his side, but had not left. James Whitmore, the trust manager, was standing near the back of the group that had gathered. I had seen him arrive 20 minutes earlier. He had not approached me. He didn't need to. We had spoken 3 days ago, in his office on 17th Street, and everything that needed to be said between us had already been said. I looked at Rebecca and I said, "I still own 67% of this company." The room absorbed that sentence the way a room absorbs something it wasn't prepared to hear, not with noise, but with a particular quality of stillness. Someone near the bar set down a glass. I heard it clearly. "I am the chairman of the board of Brennan Financial Group," I continued. Not former chairman, not founding chairman, chairman. That title was never transferred, never amended, and never contested in any document that carries legal weight. Rebecca's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I had not raised my voice. I was aware of that. I was also aware that the string quartet had stopped, not because anyone had signaled them, but because musicians are sensitive to the temperature of a room, and the temperature had changed. Sarah Okonkwo stepped forward from the edge of the gathered group. She was wearing a dark blue dress and the same reading glasses she wore in every meeting I had ever attended with her. She set a folder on the high-top table beside me, not dramatically, just placed it there and said, "Rebecca, the trust was activated this morning at 11:15. I think you should sit down." Rebecca said, "What trust? What is she talking about?" 51% of my shareholding. I said, "In trust, filed this morning with the Secretary of State. The condition attached is simple. If Eleanor's legacy is materially suppressed, the trustee exercises full voting rights immediately. No board meeting required. You can't. The bylaws require notification for any transfer above 10% to a single shareholder," Sarah said. Her voice was even. "A trust is not a shareholder. I drafted that language myself in 2019. At your request." Gerald Ashworth, standing 10 feet away, made a sound, not a laugh, something quieter. He turned it into a cough. Thomas had moved from the bar. He was standing about 15 feet away, near the edge of the group, not beside Rebecca, not beside me, the undefended middle ground he had occupied for 4 years. I had stopped expecting him to choose a side. Tonight, I had arranged things so that the choice was made for him regardless. Rebecca said, "Marcus, whatever you think you're doing." "I'm not finished," I said. She stopped. "Eleanor left a separate trust," I said. "Personal, not corporate. James Whitmore has managed it since her death. The condition for release if the person she named as beneficiary demonstrates, through documented action, that he has preserved her legacy against active opposition. The trust releases in full. I paused. James filed the activation paperwork Tuesday. A judge approved it Wednesday afternoon. James Whitmore, from near the back of the group, reached into his jacket pocket and held up a document, not unfolded, not displayed, just held. Enough for Rebecca to see that it existed. "You have not only lost your position," I said, "you have also lost the argument you've been making for 4 years. Eleanor anticipated it. She wrote it into the trust documents. She called it, in her own words, the pressure to erase. She planned for it. She was always better at planning than I was." Rebecca's face had changed in stages, the way ice changes not all at once, but in a sequence of small failures, each one making the next one faster. The certainty had gone first, then the composure. What was left now was something raw, and I did not take pleasure in looking at it. But I did not look away from it either. She had chosen this room. She had chosen this audience. She had made David Chen a witness to something she intended to be humiliating, and instead she had made him a witness to something else entirely. David was standing to my left. I did not look at him directly, but I was aware of him, the stillness of a man who has worked security for 15 years and knows the difference between a situation that is escalating and a situation that has already resolved. His hands were at his sides. His face was composed. He was not smiling, exactly, but there was something in his expression that I recognized. It was the expression of a person who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen and has just watched it happen. Rebecca said, "I need to speak with Thomas." "That's between you and Thomas," I said. She looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at the floor. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had made a series of small choices, each one reasonable in isolation, each one moving him incrementally further from the person he had been raised to be. I had watched that process for 6 years. I had not intervened, because intervention would have given him an excuse. He needed to see the destination of those small choices without me standing in the way. He was seeing it now. Rebecca turned and walked toward the exit. Not quickly, she was too controlled for that, but steadily, without looking at the timeline panel, without looking at Eleanor's photograph in the yellow blazer, without looking at the table where she had stood 20 minutes ago and told David Chen to remove me from a room I had built. Thomas watched her go. I watched him watch her. He took one step in her direction, just one, and then he stopped. His eyes moved to the timeline panel, to the photograph of Eleanor in the yellow blazer. 1987, the Larimer Street office, the beginning of everything. He stood there for 3 or 4 seconds. Then he turned back toward the center of the room. He did not follow her. It was a small thing. It was not nothing. The room remained quiet for a moment after she left. Then it began to breathe again, the particular sound of 200 people simultaneously deciding to look at each other instead of at the space where something had just happened. Conversations restarted. Someone near the bar laughed at something, a little too loudly, the way people laugh when they are releasing something they've been holding. I looked at David Chen. "Thank you, David," I said. "Eleanor would have thanked you too." David said, "She already did, sir, years ago. I just kept the receipt." I didn't fully understand what he meant by that. I thought about asking. Instead, I looked at the photograph on the timeline panel, Eleanor in 1987, the yellow blazer, the Larimer Street office, the expression on her face that I had spent 20 years trying to accurately describe and had never quite managed. Not triumphant, not merely happy, something more specific than either of those. The expression of a person who has just done something difficult and done it well and knows it. Sarah appeared at my elbow. She said quietly, "The filing is confirmed. I have the timestamp if you need it." I told her I didn't need it tonight. She said, "Thomas is going to want to talk to you." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you ready for that?" I thought about the question. Thomas was still standing in the middle of the room, in the same position, looking at the floor. He had not left with Rebecca. That was something. It was not everything, but it was something. And I had learned a long time ago from Eleanor, mostly to take accurate account of what something is without inflating it into everything. "Not tonight," I said, "but I will be." Sarah nodded and stepped away. James Whitmore caught my eye from across the room and gave me a small, precise nod, the nod of a man confirming that a transaction has been completed and the books are in order. I returned it. The string quartet had resumed playing. Something I recognized this time. I couldn't name it, but Eleanor had played it on the stereo in the Larimer Street office during the early years, on Friday afternoons when the week was done and there was nothing left to do but sit in the good chairs and look at what they'd built together. I stood for a moment in front of the timeline panel. I looked at 1984, the two of them, at a kitchen table with a legal pad. I looked at 1987. I looked at 1991, the first real office. Eleanor in a hard hat because I had insisted on it, and she had worn it to make me laugh. Then I turned and walked toward the window. And the city was still there below the lights of Denver in the October dark, the same lights that had been there the first night Eleanor and I drove up to the 16th Street overlook, and she said, "This is where we're going to build it," and I believed her completely, and she was right. I did not stay much longer after that. Rebecca's resignation came by email. I know that because Sarah Okonkwo called me at 7:43 in the morning to tell me, and when I asked how it had been delivered, she said, "Email, sent at 6:18. No phone call, no letter, no explanation beyond the standard language." I thanked her and set the phone down on the kitchen counter. Outside, the first snow of the season was coming down over Denver, not the heavy kind, just the thin, early October kind that disappears by noon. I made coffee and watched it fall. Thomas called at 9. Before that, Sarah called again at 8:20. She said Gerald Ashworth had contacted her directly that morning, not Rebecca, not the board office, but Sarah personally. He had withdrawn from a scheduled meeting with Rebecca later that week and asked to be connected instead with whoever was managing the trust transition. She also mentioned, in the same even tone she used for everything, that the building management office had contacted facilities about Rebecca's access credentials. Standard procedure, she said, when an executive departure is uncontested. I let Thomas's call ring twice before I answered. Not because I was angry. I had stopped being angry somewhere around midnight, somewhere between the storage facility on Alameda and the drive home. By 9 in the morning, I was something else entirely tired in the way that comes after a long effort is finally complete. The way I used to feel at the end of a major construction project, when the last inspection is signed and the building is standing and there is nothing left to do but go home. "Dad," Thomas said. His voice was the voice of a 36-year-old man who had not slept. "Dad, I'm sorry. I should have seen through her. I should have protected you." I didn't answer right away. I've learned that silence makes people say things they wouldn't otherwise say. Thomas said 2 more sentences, something about the gala, something about the board, and then he stopped. And the silence between us was the kind that had been building for 4 years. "You're my son," I said finally. "You'll learn from this." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's all you're going to say?" "That's all that needs to be said right now." He called back 3 hours later and asked if he could come by the house. I told him yes, but not until the afternoon. I had things to do in the morning. Sarah called again at 10:15. I was already in the car. "The trust has been activated," she said. "James Whitmore filed the paperwork Tuesday. A judge approved it Wednesday afternoon. The full asset transfer is yours, and there's a separate account Eleanor established in 2001 that Rebecca never knew existed. James said Eleanor kept it off every document she shared with anyone except him and the original attorney." I pulled into a parking lot off Colfax and stopped the car. The thin snow had stopped. The pavement was already dry. "Eleanor knew," I said. "Eh? She knew a great deal," Sarah said. "James told me she said, when she signed the trust documents, that she was writing them for the version of the future she hoped wouldn't come, but that she wanted to be ready if it did." I thanked her. Then I drove to the building. David Chen was in the lobby. He had a cup of coffee and the look of a man who had not slept much but was satisfied with the reason. He straightened when I came through the door, not the way an employee straightens for a superior, but the way a person straightens when someone they respect walks into the room. "I've been waiting for you," he said. "I know," I said. "Let's go to the 4th floor." The building was quiet at this hour. The 4th floor hallway lights came on one by one as we walked toward the far end of the corridor. Rebecca's brushed aluminum plaque was still there. Brennan Financial Group Vision, Innovation, Excellence. No name, no date, no person. David had brought the tools without being asked. It took 11 minutes. The mounting holes for Eleanor's original oak panel were still in the wall. David had measured them 3 weeks ago, the day he first noticed Rebecca trying to have the panel removed, and kept the dimensions in a notebook in his desk drawer. Eleanor's panel had been in storage on the 6th floor, in a locked room Rebecca had apparently never thought to check. We hung it together. Eleanor Brennan, founder, 1985 to 2004. The oak had darkened slightly over the years, but the engraving was still clean and precise. Eleanor had spent 3 days choosing the font, which had made me laugh at the time. She had told me that the things you put your name on deserve careful consideration. She was right about that, too. I stood there for a long moment. David stood beside me and said nothing, which was exactly right. Thomas came to the house at 3. We sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where Eleanor and I had made the first business plan, on a legal pad, though the table was different now, and the chairs. He looked like his mother around the eyes, which he always had, and which I had always been grateful for. We talked for 2 hours. I will not recount all of it here. Some conversations are not for recounting. What I will say is that by the time he left, we had agreed on the things that mattered, and the things that didn't matter we left on the table without naming them. He hugged me at the door. He hadn't done that in 4 years. I drove to the storage facility on Alameda that night. I had been there twice in 20 years, once to bring Eleanor's boxes in, and once 3 years later when I had stood in front of them and been unable to open them and had driven home without doing so. The facility was fluorescent lit and smelled of concrete and dry air. The attendant at the desk, a young woman named Priya, who was working her way through a textbook and looked up with the expression of someone who has seen stranger things than a 62-year-old man arriving at 11 at night, handed me the access card without comment. Eleanor's unit was in the back of the 3rd corridor. I had the combination memorized. I had memorized it 20 years ago and never used it. The boxes were stacked the way I had stacked them carefully, because Eleanor had been careful about everything, and I had wanted to honor that. 4 banker's boxes and 1 larger archival box in the back. The archival box was the one I had never opened. I had known, in some part of myself I had not examined closely, that what I needed was in there. I finally opened the box. The photographs were on top. Eleanor in 1985, younger than Thomas is now, standing in front of a rented office on Larimer Street with a sign she had made herself. Eleanor and me at the ribbon cutting for the first building in 1991. Eleanor in the hard hat. I held that one for a while. Beneath the photographs were letters handwritten in Eleanor's precise, slightly leftward script. Letters to clients, letters to partners, notes to herself. A small notebook with her business projections from 1986 columns of numbers in pencil, some crossed out and rewritten, the arithmetic of someone who was building something real and knew it. I turned the pages slowly. At the bottom of the box, beneath everything else, was an envelope. It was sealed. My name was written on the front in Eleanor's handwriting, Marcus, and beneath it, in smaller letters, a date 2003. She had written it the year before she died. I sat down on the concrete floor of that storage unit, with the fluorescent light humming above me and the boxes of her life arranged around me, and I opened the envelope. Marcus, if you're reading this, it means you protected what we built. I know you will. You always have, even when you were silent, especially when you were silent. That was never weakness. I need you to know that. The silence was always the strategy, and I always understood it, even when I didn't say so. We built something real. Keep it real. Keep my name on it as long as it matters, and when it stops mattering, you'll know. I love you. I have loved you since the 16th Street Overlook, and I will love you after everything else. Eleanor. I sat there for a long time. The light hummed. Somewhere in the facility, a door opened and closed. I have not cried often in my life. I cried that night, in that storage unit, holding a letter that had been waiting 20 years for the right moment to be read. I cried the way a man cries when the work is finally done, not from grief, though the grief was there too, woven through everything the way it always is, from something else, from the particular relief of having done what you set out to do, of having kept the promise you made to someone who trusted you completely, of having been, in the end, the person they believed you were. Eleanor had known. She had always known. I folded the letter carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope. I put the envelope in my jacket pocket, close to my chest. Then I closed the box and turned off the light and drove home on the same road I had been driving for 37 years. If you've ever kept a promise to someone who couldn't watch you keep it, you already know what that drive home feels like quiet in a way that doesn't need explaining. Eleanor always said the things worth building take longer than you expect. She was right about that too. If these stories find something true in you, I'll be here.